Imagine standing on the edge of despair, not knowing what the next moment will bring. This is a story you won't forget. Stay until the end to uncover a journey filled with challenges, hope, and transformation. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support keeps these stories alive. Vladimir Putin rarely had the luxury of enjoying moments of peace, but his visit to the United States was an opportunity to briefly step away from his usual responsibilities. Strolling through the bustling streets of New York City, he found himself captivated by the vibrancy of the metropolis. The constant hum of conversations, the honking of car horns, and the towering skyscrapers painted a vivid picture of a city constantly in motion. He observed people hurrying past him, each seemingly consumed by their own lives. It was a striking contrast to the more measured pace of Moscow, and he allowed himself to savor the differences. As he turned a corner onto a quieter street, his attention was drawn to a woman sitting on the cold pavement. Beside her were two young boys, both no older than 6, huddled together under a tattered blanket. Their clothing was worn and too light for the brisk autumn air, their small faces pale with exhaustion. A makeshift sign lay propped against the wall behind them, the hastily scrawled words stark and heartbreaking. "Please help us. We've lost everything." Putin's pace slowed as he approached the trio. There was a heaviness in the air around them that was impossible to ignore, a silent plea for help that spoke louder than words. The woman glanced up briefly, her tired eyes meeting his before quickly looking away. Her face bore the marks of struggle, lines etched by hardship and eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. The children sat in silence, their small hands clutching each other as if they could find solace in their shared misery. A man in a uniform, presumably a security guard from a nearby store, emerged from the building and barked at the woman to leave. "You can't sit here. You're making the place look bad," he said, his tone sharp and dismissive. The woman flinched but said nothing, her arms tightening protectively around her sons. Before she could move, Putin stepped forward, his expression calm but firm. "Is this how you treat people in need?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of authority that made the guard pause. The man muttered something under his breath and retreated, leaving Putin to kneel beside the woman and her children. He spoke gently, careful not to startle her. "What happened? Why are you out here like this?" For a moment, the woman hesitated, her lips trembling as if holding back tears. But the kindness in his voice and the sincerity in his eyes seemed to break through her walls. Slowly, she began to speak. Her name was Lisbeth, she explained, and she had once been a teacher in a small school in Atlanta. She loved her job, her students, and the sense of purpose it gave her. But tragedy struck when her husband, who worked as a construction foreman, died in a sudden accident. His death left her devastated, and without his income she struggled to make ends meet. A few months later, budget cuts forced her school to close, leaving her unemployed. With no job and mounting bills, she eventually lost her home. Since then, she had been living on the streets with her twin boys, Jacob and Elijah, desperately trying to survive. As she recounted her story, her voice wavered with a mix of shame and pain. "I've tried everything," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I've begged for work, for shelter, but no one listens. They just see me as another homeless woman, a burden." Her gaze shifted to her sons, who were watching her intently. "I don't care about myself anymore. I just want them to be safe, to have a chance at a better life." Putin listened intently, his face growing darker with every word she spoke. It was clear to him that Lisbeth was a victim of circumstances beyond her control, a woman who had been let down by the very systems that should have supported her. He glanced at the boys, their innocent faces filled with a quiet resilience that belied their age. They deserved more than this. She deserved more than this. He made his decision in an instant. "I can help you," he said, his tone resolute. Lisbeth looked at him in disbelief as if unsure whether she had heard him correctly. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. "I can offer you a fresh start," he explained. "A home, a job, and education for your children. But it will mean leaving this place and coming with me to Russia." Her eyes widened in shock, and for a moment she was silent. The proposal was almost too good to be true, and yet there was something in his demeanor that made her believe he was serious. "You do that for us?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He nodded. "Everyone deserves a second chance. I have the means to help, and I will, but you have to trust me." Lisbeth glanced at her sons, who were looking at her with hope in their eyes for the first time in months. She knew she had no other options, no other lifelines. Taking a deep breath, she nodded. "We'll go with you." A faint smile touched Putin's lips as he stood. "Then let's not waste any time." He made a quick call, arranging transportation and accommodations for Lisbeth and her sons. Within hours, they were on a plane bound for Moscow, leaving behind the cold streets of New York for a new beginning. As the plane ascended into the sky, Lisbeth looked out the window, her children sleeping peacefully beside her. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope. She didn't know what awaited them in Russia, but she knew it had to be better than the life they were leaving behind. And for now, that was enough. Lisbeth sat in the passenger seat of the car as they drove through the streets of Moscow, her sons huddled close together in the back seat, eyes wide with curiosity and apprehension. The bustling city was unlike anything they had ever seen before. The grand buildings, the cobblestone streets, and the crisp winter air painted a picture that felt almost surreal. The driver, who had introduced himself as Andriy, glanced at them occasionally through the rearview mirror, offering a kind smile. Lisbeth clutched her coat tighter around her shoulders, still trying to process the whirlwind of events that had brought her here. The car eventually pulled up in front of an apartment building in a quiet neighborhood. It was nothing extravagant, but it was clean, modern, and far more than anything Lisbeth had hoped for. Andriy stepped out first, opening the door for her and the boys. "This will be your home for now," he said warmly. "Mr. Putin wanted to make sure you'd be comfortable. Let me show you inside." Lisbeth nodded. Her words caught in her throat as she held Elijah's hand tightly and gestured for Jacob to follow. Inside, the apartment was fully furnished, with a cozy living room, a small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. The boys immediately ran to the window, marveling at the view of the snow-covered street below. Lisbeth stood in the doorway, her hands trembling as she took it all in. It had been so long since she had a place to call home that she wasn't sure how to react. Andriy noticed her hesitation and gently touched her shoulder. "You're safe here," he said softly. "Take your time to settle in. There's food in the kitchen, and if you need anything, just call the number on the table. Someone will always be available to help." After Andriy left, Lisbeth spent the evening exploring the apartment with her sons. She showed them their bedroom, with 2 small beds covered in warm blankets, and watched as they jumped onto the mattresses with joy. The sight brought tears to her eyes. For the first time in months, they could sleep without fear of being cold or hungry. She tucked them in that night, whispering a silent prayer of gratitude as she kissed their foreheads. As she sat alone in the living room later, sipping tea that had been thoughtfully provided, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. It felt as if the weight of the world had been lifted from her shoulders, but she also knew this was just the beginning. The next morning, Lisbeth was woken by the sound of her sons laughing. She found them in the kitchen, where they were amazed by the assortment of food that had been left for them. Cereal, milk, fresh fruit, and even some treats were spread across the counter. She smiled, feeling a sense of normalcy she hadn't experienced in a long time. After breakfast, there was a knock at the door. It was Andre again, this time accompanied by a woman named Natalia, who introduced herself as a representative of the local social services. Natalia explained that her job was to help Lisbeth navigate her new life in Moscow. Natalia outlined the next steps for Lisbeth and her family. The boys would be enrolled in a nearby school, where special arrangements would be made to help them adjust to the new language and culture. Lisbeth would be given a position at a social center that worked with families in need. Natalia assured her that she would receive support every step of the way. Lisbeth listened intently, nodding as Natalia explained the details. The prospect of working again filled her with both hope and anxiety. She hadn't held a job since losing her teaching position, and she worried about how she would adapt to the challenges ahead. The boys started school a few days later. Lisbeth walked them to the gates, her heart pounding with a mix of pride and nervousness. The school was large and modern, with children running around the playground bundled up in coats and scarves. Jacob and Elijah held her hands tightly, their small faces full of uncertainty. A teacher greeted them warmly and assured Lisbeth that the boys would be in good hands. As she watched them disappear into the building, Lisbeth felt a pang of fear. She knew this was necessary, but it didn't make it any easier to let them go. Back at the apartment, Lisbeth prepared for her own first day at the social center. She arrived early, dressed in modest but clean clothes that had been provided for her. The center was bustling with activity, filled with people from all walks of life. Some were volunteers, others were clients seeking assistance. The director, a kind woman named Irina, welcomed Lisbeth and introduced her to the team. "We're glad to have you here," Irina said. "Your experiences will bring a valuable perspective to the work we do." Lisbeth spent her first day observing and learning. She helped organize donations, prepared meals, and spoke with some of the families who came in for support. It was overwhelming, but also deeply fulfilling. She saw pieces of herself in the faces of the people she met, and it reminded her why she had become a teacher in the first place, to help others. By the end of the day, she was exhausted but grateful. Irina stopped her before she left, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You did well today," she said. "This is just the beginning." Over the next few weeks, Lisbeth and her sons began to settle into their new routine. The boys adjusted to school more quickly than she expected, their natural curiosity and friendliness helping them make friends despite the language barrier. Jacob, in particular, excelled in math, surprising his teachers with his quick understanding of new concepts. Elijah was more reserved but found joy in art, often bringing home drawings that decorated the walls of their apartment. Lisbeth poured herself into her work at the social center, finding purpose in helping others. She started learning Russian in the evenings, determined to bridge the gap between herself and the people she was now surrounded by. Despite the challenges, Lisbeth began to feel a sense of belonging. She still had moments of doubt and fear, but they were outweighed by the progress she saw in herself and her children. One evening, as she watched Jacob and Elijah play in the snow outside their building, she realized how far they had come. They were laughing, their cheeks rosy from the cold, and for the first time in a long time, they looked like carefree children. Lisbeth wiped away a tear, her heart full of gratitude. She knew they still had a long journey ahead, but for the first time, she truly believed they would be okay. Weeks turned into months, and Lisbeth found herself slowly adapting to her new life in Moscow. Each day brought its own challenges, but it also brought moments of hope and small victories that kept her going. Her job at the social center became more than just a way to make ends meet. It became a place where she found a sense of purpose and belonging. The other employees, though initially distant, began to warm up to her. They admired her work ethic and the compassion she showed toward the families who came to the center for help. Irina, the director, often complimented her ability to connect with people, saying, "You've been where they are. That's something no amount of training can teach." At home, Jacob and Elijah were thriving in school. The language barrier, which had seemed like an insurmountable obstacle at first, was gradually fading as the boys picked up Russian with the ease that only children seem to possess. Jacob's teachers were particularly impressed with his aptitude for mathematics, and one day he came home with a flyer for a school-wide math competition. "Mama, can I do it?" he asked, his eyes shining with excitement. Lisbeth hesitated. She worried that the pressure might be too much for him, that he might feel out of place among his peers. But when she saw the determination in his face, she couldn't bring herself to say no. "Of course you can," she said, pulling him into a hug. "You can do anything you set your mind to." Elijah, on the other hand, had found his passion in art. His drawings, once simple and unrefined, had become increasingly detailed and imaginative. One evening, he showed Lisbeth a picture he had drawn of their family, the three of them standing in front of their apartment building, surrounded by snow. "This is us," he explained, pointing to each figure. "And this is Moscow. It's our new home." Lisbeth felt tears prick her eyes as she looked at the drawing. It was a simple picture, but it captured so much: their journey, their resilience, and the new life they were building together. Lisbeth's own progress was slower but steady. She spent her evenings studying Russian, often staying up late into the night to practice her vocabulary and grammar. It was exhausting, but she was determined to learn. She wanted to be able to communicate with the people around her, to truly integrate into her new community. One day, during a particularly busy afternoon at the social center, a woman came in with her 2 children. She was clearly distressed, her voice shaken as she explained her situation to Irina. Lisbeth watched from across the room, her heart aching for the woman. Without thinking, she stepped forward and began speaking to her in halting Russian. "I can help," she said, her words slow but sincere. The woman looked at her, surprised, and then nodded. Together, they sat down and worked through the paperwork she needed to apply for assistance. It was a small moment, but for Lisbeth, it felt like a breakthrough. The turning point came when Jacob competed in the math competition. Lisbeth had taken the day off work to attend, and she sat in the audience, her heart pounding as she watched her son solve problem after problem on the whiteboard. He was the smallest competitor there, and the only one who wasn't a native Russian speaker, but he didn't let that faze him. When the final scores were announced, Jacob had placed first. The room erupted in applause, and Lisbeth felt an overwhelming surge of pride as she watched him accept his certificate. "You did it," she whispered to him afterward, pulling him into a tight embrace. "I'm so proud of you." News of Jacob's achievement quickly spread through the school, and it wasn't long before it reached the local media. A journalist from a community newspaper contacted Lisbeth, asking if she would be willing to share her family's story. At first, she was hesitant. She didn't want to draw attention to herself or her past, and she worried about how the article might be received. But Irina encouraged her, saying, "Your story could inspire so many people. It shows that no matter how hard things get, there's always hope." After much consideration, Lisbeth agreed. The interview took place at the social center. The journalist, a young woman named Olga, was kind and patient, guiding Lisbeth through the process and reassuring her whenever she stumbled over her words. They talked about everything: Lisbeth's life in the United States, the challenges she had faced, and the incredible journey that had brought her to Moscow. She spoke about her sons, her work at the center, and the kindness of the people who had helped her along the way. By the time the interview was over, Lisbeth felt a sense of relief. She had been afraid to revisit the pain of her past, but sharing her story had reminded her of how far she had come. When the article was published, the response was overwhelmingly positive. People from all over the city reached out, offering words of support and encouragement. Some even came to the social center to volunteer or donate, inspired by Lisbeth's resilience and determination. She was humbled by the outpouring of kindness, and began to see her story not just as a personal journey, but as a way to bring hope to others. Irina, ever the optimist, saw the article as an opportunity to expand the center's reach. "We could use this momentum to start new programs," she said, "and I want you to be part of it." For the first time in a long time, Lisbeth felt like she had a purpose. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, contributing, and making a difference. Her sons were thriving, her work was meaningful, and she was surrounded by people who believed in her. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments when the weight of the past threatened to overwhelm her. But when she looked at Jacob and Elijah, she knew it was all worth it. They had come so far, and she was determined to keep moving forward. One evening, as Lisbeth sat by the window, watching the snow fall softly onto the streets below, Jacob and Elijah ran into the room, their faces glowing with excitement. "Mama, look," Jacob said, holding up a small certificate he had received from school for his math achievements. "And I drew this," Elijah added, handing her another drawing. It was a picture of their family, but this time it included the social center and the people they had met there. Lisbeth smiled, her heart full as she pulled her sons close. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. "We're going to be more than okay." Lisbeth's story continued to gain traction in Moscow, resonating with people from all walks of life. Her journey from despair to hope struck a chord, and the community around her began to rally in ways she never could have imagined. People she had never met would stop her on the street to offer kind words or ask how they could help. Donations to the social center increased dramatically, and volunteers began flooding in, inspired by her resilience and determination. For the first time, Lisbeth felt like she truly belonged somewhere. It was a feeling she had almost forgotten, a warmth she hadn't experienced since before her husband's death. One morning, Irina called Lisbeth into her office. She had a proposal, one that would push Lisbeth out of her comfort zone but could also expand the impact of her story. "We've been invited to speak at a conference about homelessness and social reform," Irina explained, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. It's a chance to share what we've accomplished here and to inspire others to take action in their own communities. I'd like you to come with me and speak about your experiences." Lisbeth's first instinct was to decline. Public speaking was far outside her realm of experience, and the thought of standing in front of a room full of people made her stomach churn. But Irina's encouragement and her belief in the importance of sharing their work eventually convinced her to agree. The weeks leading up to the conference were a whirlwind of preparation. Irina helped Lisbeth write her speech, guiding her through the process of organizing her thoughts and focusing on the key points she wanted to convey. "Just speak from the heart," Irina said one afternoon as they sat in the quiet of the social center. "That's what people will remember." Lisbeth practiced her speech tirelessly, often late into the night after putting Jacob and Elijah to bed. She stood in front of the mirror, reciting the words over and over until they felt like second nature. Yet, no matter how much she prepared, the fear of failure lingered in the back of her mind. The day of the conference arrived, and Lisbeth found herself standing backstage in a large auditorium, her hands trembling as she clutched the note cards containing her speech. Irina stood beside her, offering words of encouragement and a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You've got this," Irina said, her voice firm. "Remember, you're not just telling your story. You're giving a voice to so many others who can't tell theirs." Lisbeth nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself. When her name was announced, she stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the applause that greeted her. The room was filled with people, government officials, nonprofit leaders, and community members, all waiting to hear what she had to say. For a moment, Lisbeth froze, her mind blank as she stared out at the sea of faces. But then, she spotted Jacob and Elijah sitting in the front row, their eyes full of pride and encouragement, and something inside her shifted. She took a deep breath and began to speak. Her voice was shaky at first, but as she told her story, it grew stronger. She spoke about the struggles she had faced, the kindness of strangers that had saved her, and the importance of giving people a second chance. She spoke about the social center and the transformative work they were doing, and about the need for compassion and understanding in addressing issues of poverty and homelessness. By the time she finished, the room was silent, every eye fixed on her. Then, as if on cue, the audience erupted into applause. Lisbeth felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over her as she stepped off the stage. Irina was waiting for her, a wide smile on her face. "You were incredible," she said, pulling Lisbeth into a hug. "I knew you could do it." That evening, as they returned home, Lisbeth couldn't stop smiling. She had faced one of her biggest fears and come out stronger on the other side. The conference proved to be a turning point not only for Lisbeth but also for the social center. The attention they received led to new partnerships and funding opportunities, allowing them to expand their programs and reach even more people in need. Irina asked Lisbeth to take on a larger role in the organization, overseeing new initiatives and working directly with donors and community leaders. It was a daunting responsibility, but Lisbeth embraced it wholeheartedly. She had found her calling, and she was determined to make the most of it. Meanwhile, Jacob and Elijah continued to thrive. Jacob's success in math earned him a spot in an advanced program at school, where he began working on projects that challenged and excited him. Elijah, inspired by his brother's achievements, threw himself into his art, creating pieces that were so impressive they caught the attention of his teachers. One day, he brought home a letter from school inviting him to participate in a citywide art exhibition. "Mama, can we go?" he asked, his face lighting up with excitement. Lisbeth hugged him tightly. "Of course we can," she said. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." The exhibition was held in a gallery downtown, and Lisbeth felt a surge of pride as she watched Elijah stand beside his artwork, explaining his inspiration to visitors. The piece he had submitted was a drawing of their family, surrounded by the people and places that had helped them rebuild their lives. "This is my mom," he said to one woman, pointing to the central figure in the drawing. "She's my hero." Lisbeth's eyes filled with tears as she listened, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had spent so much time worrying about how to provide for her sons that she hadn't realized how much of an impact her strength and resilience had had on them. As the months went on, Lisbeth's work at the social center and her role in the community continued to grow. She became a trusted voice on issues of poverty and homelessness, often called upon to speak at events and meetings. Her story was featured in newspapers and on television, and people from all over the country reached out to her for advice and support. Despite the attention, Lisbeth remained humble, always redirecting the focus to the work they were doing at the center and the people they were helping. One evening, as she sat at the kitchen table reviewing plans for a new program, Jacob and Elijah came to sit beside her. "Mama," Jacob said, his voice serious, "do you think we'll ever go back to America?" Lisbeth paused, considering his question. "Maybe, one day," she said, "but for now, this is our home, and as long as we're together, that's all that matters." The boys nodded, satisfied with her answer, and the three of them sat in comfortable silence, the warmth of their small apartment a stark contrast to the cold streets they had once called home. Lisbeth knew there would still be challenges ahead. Life was rarely easy, and the past had taught her not to take anything for granted. But as she looked at her sons, their faces full of hope and promise, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. They had come so far, and she was determined to keep moving forward, one step at a time. The day of the grand opening of the new social center arrived, and Lisbeth found herself standing in the midst of a flurry of activity. Volunteers carried boxes of supplies inside, while a group of local children practiced songs they would perform during the ceremony. The center was much larger than the one she had started working at months ago, with modern facilities and enough space to accommodate dozens of families. It was a culmination of months of hard work, collaboration, and community support. Lisbeth looked around, her heart swelling with pride. She had never imagined that her story, once filled with so much pain, could lead to something so meaningful. Jacob and Elijah ran up to her, their faces glowing with excitement. Both boys had been given small roles in the ceremony, and they were eager to contribute. "Mama, look! They gave us these ribbons to hand out to people," Jacob said, holding up a bundle of colorful ribbons. Elijah nodded, adding, "And I'm going to help put them on the guests when they come in." Lisbeth smiled, crouching down to hug them both. "You're going to do an amazing job," she said. "I'm so proud of you." As the guests began to arrive, Lisbeth felt a mix of nerves and excitement. Among them were city officials, community leaders, and even representatives from the media. Irina was busy greeting people and directing them to their seats, but she paused to give Lisbeth an encouraging nod. "You're ready for this," she said quietly. "Just speak from the heart, like you always do." Lisbeth nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself. The ceremony began with a few words from the mayor, who praised the work of the social center and the impact it had already made on the community. Then it was Lisbeth's turn to speak. She stepped up to the podium, her hands gripping the sides as she looked out at the crowd. For a moment, the enormity of the moment threatened to overwhelm her. But then she saw Jacob and Elijah standing in the front row, their eyes filled with pride, and she felt a wave of calm wash over her. She began to speak, her voice steady and filled with emotion. "A year ago, I was sitting on a cold street corner, wondering how I was going to keep my children safe," she said. "I had lost everything, my home, my job, my sense of hope. I thought there was no way out." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the audience. But then something extraordinary happened. A stranger saw me, not as a problem to be ignored, but as a person in need of help. That act of kindness changed my life and gave me a second chance. She went on to talk about the work of the social center and the importance of compassion and community. She shared stories of the families they had helped and the lives they had touched. "This center is more than just a building," she said. "It's a symbol of what we can accomplish when we come together to support one another. It's a reminder that no one is ever truly alone." When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Lisbeth stepped back from the podium, her heart pounding, and was immediately surrounded by people offering congratulations and words of encouragement. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Lisbeth gave interviews to reporters, posed for photos with the volunteers, and spent time speaking with the families who had already begun using the center's services. Jacob and Elijah were never far from her side, their excitement and energy infectious. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the city, Lisbeth found a moment to step outside and take it all in. The past year had been a whirlwind of change, and standing there, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. She thought back to that day on the street corner in New York, when her world had felt so small and hopeless. It was hard to believe how far she'd come since then. Irina joined her, handing her a cup of tea. "You've done something incredible here," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "You should be proud." Lisbeth nodded, her eyes misting with tears. "I am," she said, "but I couldn't have done it without you, without this community. It's not just my story, it's all of ours." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as the lights of the city began to twinkle against the darkening sky. Later that evening, Lisbeth returned home with Jacob and Elijah. The boys were still buzzing with excitement, recounting every detail of the day as they sat around the dinner table. "Mama, did you see how many people came to the center?" Jacob asked, his eyes wide. "And did you hear them clapping for you?" Elijah added, grinning. Lisbeth laughed, feeling a warmth in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. "I did," she said, "and I couldn't have done it without you two by my side." After the boys were asleep, Lisbeth sat by the window, gazing out at the quiet street below. The snow was falling softly, blanketing the city in a layer of white. She thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. The struggles, the heartbreak, the unexpected kindness of a stranger who had seen her when no one else had. It hadn't been an easy journey, but it had been worth it. She had found a home, a purpose, and a community that believed in her. And most importantly, she had given her sons a chance at a better life. As she closed her eyes that night, Lisbeth felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time it didn't scare her. She knew they would face challenges, but she also knew they would face them together. And that was enough. The next morning, Lisbeth woke up to the sound of laughter coming from the boys' room. She found them sitting on the floor, drawing pictures of the social center and the people they had met there. "Look, Mama," Elijah said, holding up his drawing. "This is us helping other people, just like you do." Lisbeth smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You're my heroes," she said softly, "both of you." As she watched them, she realized that their story was far from over. It was just beginning. There were still so many people who needed help, so many lives that could be changed, and she was ready to be a part of that change. Together, they would continue to build a future filled with hope, compassion, and the belief that even the smallest acts of kindness could make the biggest difference. Thank you for watching this story of resilience and hope. If it inspired you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Your support means everything and helps us bring more stories like this to life.